Namaste, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you, Shital, for the introduction. Thank you, Pari, for inviting me, and Patriji, and also my friend Christiane Elsoyan, who I got to listen to a little bit yesterday as well. And I know she's a supporter of this movement. So I really appreciate all that you all are doing here. And I thank you for inviting me to make this presentation today. And I'm going to share about my work a little bit, but not so much my background as you got that introduction, but a specific part of this field of what I call cosmometry that pertains to certain energy patterns we see in nature and some of the work that you are all involved with. So I'm going to actually jump into a presentation now, probably last about 35 to 40 minutes. I will share my screen first. And get this on the screen here. So please let me know, are you seeing my screen?
Yes, I can.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, again, thank you for having me today. It's an honor to be here with you all during this Spiritual Science International Meet. I'm going to be presenting today about what I call the phi scaling angle, nature's basket weave of energy coherence. And I wanted to first begin by acknowledging the birthday, the 125th birthday celebration of Buckminster Fuller. Some of you may know who he is and was. He was really a primary teacher of mine. You can see he was very involved in understanding the dynamics of the cosmos, and he did a lot to benefit humankind. And today is his birthday, so I wanted to celebrate that. And the foundation of this body of knowledge that I'm presenting about today, I call it cosmometry, and it's really the cosmic geometry of the universe. And I have a book called Cosmometry, exploring the holofractal nature of the cosmos, which goes in depth into much more than I'm presenting here today. The main sections of that book are called wholeness, starting from zero, flow process, field pattern, structural integrity, music, the master code, and consciousness in the human experience. And I'm going to be just touching into a small part of a few of these sections today as I go through this presentation about the phi scaling angle. I want to begin with this quote from the great physicist named David Bohm, who was also a very deeply spiritual man. And he had a wonderful view about the nature of the universe. I think was truly the most correct in its day. He says, what I am proposing here is that man's general way of thinking of the totality, his general worldview, is crucial for overall order of the human mind itself. If he thinks of the totality as constituted of independent fragments, then that is how his mind will tend to operate. But if he can include everything coherently and harmoniously in an overall whole that is undivided, unbroken, and without a border, where every border is a division or break, then his mind will tend to move in a similar way, and from this will flow an orderly action within the whole. So really having wholeness be the central principle of the organizing of the universe. I know that's very common in your understanding here. And Bohm referred to this as undivided wholeness in flowing movement, the most fundamental principle in his view of physics. Using the analogy of vortices in a stream of water, Bohm said that all manifest phenomena that we call matter and energy are temporarily stable abstractions similar to what we perceive as individual whirlpools in what is fundamentally a unified flowing movement of water. The vortices in the water are each unique and appear independent from the others, yet they are all connected simultaneously throughout the entire stream in a state of undivided wholeness. This is the same for the entire cosmos, according to Bohm's worldview. Now, as we go through this journey, and as is fundamental to the cosmometry presentation overall. There are three lenses through which to perceive and study one phenomena. That phenomenon is the expression and interaction of energy, matter, and information. And those three lenses are cosmometry, which is the cosmic geometry, unified physics, which is based on the work of Nassim Haramein, who I work closely with at the Resonance Science Foundation, and music, that we're all very familiar with what that is. Now, the cosmometry is the study of the fundamental patterns, structures, processes, and systems that are inherent in manifestation at all scales within the cosmos. And so we can see the patterns are these two-dimensional symbolic representations of what then are three-dimensional forms and structures in nature and in the cosmos. And then the processes are the dynamic flow of the energy that most commonly appears as vortexes and as toruses in their flow. And the systems are the relationships of all these energy dynamics. For instance, here seen as the relationships of music. Unified physics is a mathematically and geometrically based theory that offers a long-sought resolution to the fundamental discrepancies between quantum mechanics and general relativity. It offers a practical understanding of the source of energy, mass, gravity, and the speed of light, none of which have been accurately described in prior theories as to what the source of those are. And it offers a broader context of physics as it applies to all the sciences. And music, we're all familiar with, but it has a whole nother role really in universal dynamics. It's a system of harmonic and rhythmic proportions that are inherent in the quantized nature of the cosmos. Harmonic and rhythmic proportions are characteristics of quantization itself and are the primary basis for the fractal aspect of manifestation, that which accommodates matter, energy formation seamlessly across all scales. I wanted to first begin with just touching into some core principles about wholeness itself that are fundamental to this model. And as we venture into these concepts of wholeness, we need an understanding of what they are pertaining to, especially within the context of our exploration of cosmometry, unified physics, and music. And while the following may sound simplistic given the enormous variety and dynamic complexity of the human experience, it appears that the entire cosmic phenomena of our experience and our experience of it is composed of three fundamental attributes. And these are electromagnetic radiation and gravitation, acoustic compression, and information. And these are really the most essential energy dynamics that are at play in the universe. And we can also readily describe these with very simple terms that we're familiar with: light, sound, and consciousness. And as we explore this journey, we have these three words: energy, matter, and information. And they're all describing one phenomenon here. And we know that from Einstein's famous E equals mc squared equation, that energy and matter are interchangeable when factored by the speed of light squared. Therefore, they can be understood as apparently different states of the same thing. Energy and matter are one and the same. And they are both carriers of information. And with this understanding, we view the three universal attributes of energy, matter, and information as one phenomenon. We could say light and sound and consciousness are all one and the same. And that's all that's present throughout the entire universe. Now, a fundamental principle of wholeness is what we call holographic wholeness, or the holographic principle. And while it's being debated as to whether the universe is holographic in modern physics, it's clearly the case when you just kind of really look at the picture here. Now, I use a very simple definition of what this holographic principle is, and it is the image of the whole is present at every point. And it's showing how the entire field of light that we are in, that we see, that we are made of, is completely holographic, where the image of the whole is present at every point. No matter where you put your eye, you're going to see the entirety of the view of the light field around you from all directions. That's the definition of a hologram there. And if that weren't the case, we wouldn't even be able to perceive the world the way we do. The same is true actually for sound. Sound is holosonic. The sound of the whole is present at every point. And so wherever we are standing, we're hearing the sound of the entire environment around us from all directions at every point, no matter where we stand. And the fundamental aspect of the universe is the information aspect. And we can say that the universe is hologramic, meaning the information of the whole is present at every point. Very profound when you really take this to the ultimate conclusion that the information of the entire cosmos, the entire universe, is present at every point in the universe as a fundamental principle of this hologramic nature. And the next principle of wholeness is the fractal nature of it. A simple definition, again, the same pattern repeats at all scales. We can see here in the veins of the leaf and in the tributaries of a river and in the lightning, the same pattern at different scales. And the fractalization aspect is the harmonic expression of the quantized nature. And this is very important to understand that the nature of the universe is that it's quantized, that from the smallest electromagnetic wavelength at the Planck scale, the tiniest measurable or theoretical scale, it's not even measurable yet, to those at the atomic scale and on up in size to visible light, microwaves, radio waves, and beyond, the entire cosmic phenomenon of electromagnetic radiation is quantized. This is what Max Planck discovered, and Einstein proved it, and he called the unit of the quantization a photon. And the fractal aspect is the harmonic relationship of that quantized field. And then the next aspect of wholeness that's important to understand is the synergetic nature, where the behavior of whole systems is greater than and unpredictable from the behavior of the parts when taken separately. It's really quite a fascinating phenomenon that Buckminster Fuller was deeply involved with, and he called his body of work about the geometry of nature. He called it synergetics. And another great pioneer in science and research, Arthur Young, said about this, only when the device is put together can it express its function and its purpose, something its parts alone could never do. Since purpose is in the whole and not in the parts, the whole must be greater than the parts. How can we account for this? Because the whole cannot function when divided. It follows that function is that aspect or cause which is not in the parts and which science cannot deal with, because science deals with mass, length, and time, which are parts. This leads to a basic cosmological postulate. The parts are derived from the whole and not the whole from the parts. In other words, the whole exists before the parts. Very important perspective shift on science, and of course in the spiritual science, I think that's a given. And it really informs how we even begin the process of investigating the nature of reality. Start from the whole, start from wholeness. And we're also starting from zero, another section of my book called Starting from Zero. And I wanted to just touch into this very simply here to describe the nature and the geometry of the 0-point field. Now, all energetic expression is dynamic fluctuation on either side of a zero reference, whether that's light waves or sound waves or breathing or walking or wind or you name it. Everything that's moving is fluctuating around a 0-point reference. And a key principle of the 0-point nature is equilibrium. And we can think of equilibrium as the balance between hot and cold to achieve a comfortable temperature in our home. Any kind of a balance where the dynamic forces stabilize into equilibrium. Now, Buckminster Fuller discovered that there is a geometry of this equilibrium state, and he called it a vector equilibrium. And you can see in this image here that all of the lines, the vectors, the edges on the outside, and all the ones going to the center are exactly the same length. As he said, the explosive outward force and the implosive inward force come into equilibrium. And this is the balanced 0-point state geometry here. And it's a 4-dimensional geometry. What that means is we're familiar with 3-dimensional coordinate system, the XYZ cubic space. The vector equilibrium is actually a 4-dimensional coordinate system. It has 4 hexagonal planes that are going through the center point. And it creates a 4-dimensional coordinate system that Buckminster Fuller came to understand is actually more accurate to how the universe is formed than the 3-dimensional one that we use. And I won't go into why that is so, but it's a very profound insight. I think it's very important. And I also think as it relates to the pyramid geometry, that is, it's a octahedral space, and of course the pyramids are half an octahedral form, which very much is directly then tied into this 0-point equilibrium geometry. And I think can give us some great insight into an aspect of the geometry of the pyramids and their effects that we are experiencing. Buckminster Fuller said about the vector equilibrium, it is absolutely dead center of universe and will never be seen by man in any physical experience. Yet it is the frame of reference, and it is not in rotation, and it is sizeless and timeless. So it's the state of the universe that transcends time and space, and we now understand there's a geometry to that. And actually the underlying field, what we call the Planck field of electromagnetic vibration at the tiniest scale, is actually in this equilibrium state in the unified physics theory. Bucky Fuller said, equilibrium between positive and negative is 0. The vector equilibrium is the true 0 reference of the energetic mathematics. So it's important to know what the 0 reference is. Now, the vector equilibrium, being the 0 reference, is also the source of all vibration, because it has a dynamic pulsation that Fuller called the jitterbug. And what that looks like is we see these square faces that are open here. Well, they're not stable in their geometry, and they can collapse, and the whole thing can expand and contract and breathe and open. And this is what's happening throughout the entire universe to create the universe, this kind of emotion. And so this same form creates all of the platonic solids and all the vibrational activity in the universe. And that leads us to this next section here that I'm just going to touch into briefly about flow process. And the flow process, once the activity of the universe comes into being, it can achieve a dynamic equilibrium state. And the most coherent form of that is called the torus. And you can see the dynamic flow of energy around the outside and through the central vortex of this torus pattern here. And at the center of the torus is a still point center that's connecting back to the 0-point field. So all the dynamic systems are always connecting back into that universal 0-point field. And we ourselves have the same kind of a center point in our Dantian. I'm sure many or all of you are already familiar with this, and the chakras and the Dantian in the heart and the head. All are these center points that connect us back into this 0-point state in the dynamic equilibrium. Now, this toroidal dynamic flow process is fractal, and it's embedded one within the other to create the movement, the undivided wholeness and flowing movement that Bohm describes. And you can see a simple illustration of that embedded fractal toroidal vortex flow here. And we can see examples of that in the acorn and the apple and the tree, our own toroidal field around our bodies, our bioenergetic field, the magnetic field of the Earth, galaxies, everything all embedded in this coordinated, coherent, dynamic toroidal fractal flow. And that brings me to this, what I call the unified model of cosmometry, which starts to bring these pieces together. We see the vector equilibrium geometry with in orange, with also a green spherical version of the same geometry that's called a Genesa crystal. And that's the 0-point stillness that then fluctuates and pulsates to create the toroidal flow dynamic. And then across the middle of this model is what's called the phi double spiral, and that's where we're heading into next as we get towards the phi scaling angle. And this is a section of the book called Field Pattern, and it's about how the phi ratio shows up in the field of space around us. So it begins our exploration of this pattern begins by seeing that the patterns that we can see as two-dimensional representations are actually showing us three-dimensional phenomena that we can illustrate in these basic forms of energetic articulations. For example, the triangle and the square, the pentagon, hexagon, these all relate to forms in nature. The triangle with the radiolaria, the square with the cube of salt, pentagon with flowers, hexagon with snowflakes, the radials with the flowers and the shells, the rings with water, the spiral of the nautilus and the double spiral of the sunflower. All these patterns we can see very clearly in nature. And so we're going to focus now on this double spiral pattern at the center of the model. And this pattern is actually the cross-section of a torus. And you can see how, imagine how this whole toroidal flow dynamic would have this pattern throughout it. And again, here's what that pattern looks like from above, looking straight down on this double spiral field pattern. Now you'll notice I want to point out that which I call the phi boundary condition is a circle that actually emerges when you make this pattern from a single spiral and you duplicate it and rotate it. This boundary emerges quite spontaneously, and it was quite a surprise when I first discovered this, but it explained a lot as to how nature is creating these boundary conditions. And here we can see an example of what that same pattern would look like as a torus in this cone flower here. Now, to understand the phi scaling angle, I just want to provide a brief introduction to the Fibonacci numbers and the phi ratio, which probably most everybody here is already familiar with, but in case anybody isn't, here's a simple introduction. The Fibonacci sequence is a series of numbers derived by starting with the numbers 0 and 1, adding them together to get 1. Then you take the first one and the second one together to get 2, and add 1 and 2 to get 3, and 2 and 3 to get 5, and 3 and 5 to get 8, etc. You get this sequence of numbers called the Fibonacci sequence. And now, these are related to the phi ratio because when each pair of numbers is divided, the farther out the sequence you go, the closer the result gets to the mathematical phi ratio. So nature is actually using the quantized Fibonacci numbers to approximate the phi ratio. The phi ratio, of course, is a ratio of 1 to 1.618. And that's what nature, through the quantization and the harmonics of the phi Fibonacci numbers, is actually coordinating space and time with this ratio. And this brings us to the phi scaling angle, which is 27.3 degrees. And it's derived quite simply by taking a series of circles or spheres, each one in a Fibonacci number diameter of growth. And you can see it creates this green angle here, which I call the phi scaling angle, 27.3 degrees. And I became very fascinated by this angle a long time ago and began to see its presence in nature quite a bit, which I'll show you in just a moment. But I also want to show you a very key aspect of the role this angle plays in very fundamental universal energy dynamics. And to do so, I want to build up a blueprint, a phi blueprint, and show you how it gets derived. It begins with a series of little units, little squares, each growing with Fibonacci numbers of units with 90-degree turns to create this little matrix here. We could add squares to define each one of those. And when we do, we get what are called golden rectangles, where one edge is the unit of 1 and the other edge is 1.618. And the whole matrix of these squares becomes a matrix of golden rectangles that are fractally embedded. Within each square, we can then add a quarter circle arc. That's the same radius as the edge length of the square. And that creates a very close approximation to a phi spiral. It's the quantized phi spiral, not the mathematically derived one. But nature is using the quantized phi spiral. And to this, we can add what I call nodal points, these little red points that show each iteration of the phi ratio across the spiral here. And this is important because here now I've just zoomed back out to where I'm seeing a larger portion of the spiral. We were just looking at this quadrant up here. Now we're seeing a bigger part of the spiral, which can go on into infinity. And connecting all these nodes creates what I call this nodal axis that is fundamental to the geometry that's creating this phi ratio, this phi spiral. And then continuing on in the process, we now take the original spiral and duplicate it, spin it to create a phi vortex. And this is what we see in nature. We see mostly vortexes and double spirals rather than just the single spiral. So it's important to be able to map it as a vortex. And you can see actually right here that that boundary condition I mentioned earlier actually appeared when we did that. And that's what happens every time you spin these phi spirals. And now in the universe, we have two spiraling directions. We have this counterclockwise spiral that's going in towards the center in a counterclockwise manner. And we have the same thing happening in the opposite direction, a clockwise spiral. And this is called chirality. That's the spin of systems within the universe. And there's actually an offset angle between the two. So if I go back to this first one, you can see the nodal axis coming down this way here. And the next one, the nodal axis is coming down this way. So there's actually a differential between the two geometries that create this phi ratio spin. It turns out that this differential chirality offset angle is exactly the phi scaling angle, which I didn't realize for many years until it suddenly dawned on me. I looked at it and I said, that looks about the same. And it turns out it's exactly the same. So this phi scaling angle is really fundamental to how energy dynamics are organizing in the spiraling directions of systems within the universe. Phi scaling angle, there it is. And so within this one blueprint now, we have the Fibonacci units, the little squares. We have the golden rectangles. We have the phi spirals themselves. Then we have the phi double spiral field pattern. We have the phi proportions of the circles. And we have the phi scaling angle. And actually, when we zoom in to the center, we once again highlight that we also have the phi boundary condition. So this is really, for me, kind of a master blueprint of how the phi ratio is organizing in the universe. And I want to show you some examples of this phi double spiral pattern before we get to the phi scaling angle in nature. And again, we're looking at this fundamental double spiral pattern as the cross-section of a torus that is really the most fundamental coherent organizing form of energy dynamics. And we can see that here in Mammillaria cactus that creates a beautiful double spiral with this toroidal round shape. You see the same thing with the pine cone, and the spirals in one direction and in the other direction are both Fibonacci number quantities. We see the same thing with the pineapple, both in the fruit of the body and in the leaves, you can see. So this vortex of energy is creating this form. Here we see it in the branch of a spruce tree, and we can see where the needles used to be on the branch now show us that there's the same double spiral pattern going on every branch, every twig of that spruce tree. The same pattern is being followed. Here is the same tree, literally the same tree. I took this picture 2 different times of year. Showing the spruce cone double spiral pattern. Now here we see a red smoke flare, and an airplane has just taken off right by that flare, and the spiral off the wingtip is creating this phi vortex. And you can see I put the boundary condition here to show how that whole thing is really clearly coordinating in that phi ratio relationship. We can see the same thing here with this Hurricane Katrina, beautiful phi spiral, and the eye would be where the boundary condition is defining that space, the inside and the outside of the system. Now we go up to this huge scale, 90 light years across. at this galactic scale to see exactly the same pattern. You see now the fractal nature and the toroidal phi ratio embedded aspect of universal energy dynamics. And here's one of my favorites. I just find this so fascinating, taking that boundary condition and putting it over the iris of the eye and looking at the double spiral field pattern. You can see how beautiful the contours are of the nose and of the eyebrow and of the eyelids here, how well it's coordinated with this field pattern. There's a whole area of study yet to really be done in this dynamic, but it certainly visibly shows us that there's something correlated clearly to how this pattern is organizing. And I find this fascinating how our eyes, our consciousness, our perception on the world, our bodies are all made of this universal field expressing and coordinating in this beautiful, harmonious way, all as one. So that brings us now to the main topic of what I wanted to show you and how it was derived is the phi basket weave and the phi scaling angle. And it begins by looking at trees. And trees, of course, are torus dynamic systems. In fact, we can see them as a double torus system with the tree canopy at the top and the roots down below in the earth, exchanging resources throughout the whole system and the environment. And we can view a torus as a set of spirals in both directions. And when we do, we can see that the energy is moving around the outside and then down the central vortex. And that central vortex, when we zoom in, it has this very distinct basket weave pattern, which in fact looks very much like the trunk of a tree. And in fact, the trees, many, many trees, you can see this basket weave pattern in them. And upon analyzing the geometry of that basket weave, simply taking the phi scaling angle and putting it over that pattern, we find that it's exactly using that geometry, that proportion, and that angle to create this basket weave pattern. Here's another example of a massive redwood tree in California with the basket weave pattern, and here's the phi scaling angle applied to it. And you can see how precise it really is at this massive scale. And so you can see this is a cohering energy pattern that is showing up as form in many ways in nature, and how nature is, basically applying this to create coherence in the energy dynamics. Here we see it as it appears in the sand on the beach. So this is when the wave comes in up onto the sand and then it pulls back out. It leaves this basket weave pattern in the sand that I kept looking at and thinking, I bet you that's the same angle. And sure enough, it's exactly the same angle. And so we can see now how the sand on the beach is like the surface of a whole toroidal flow, the double spiraling, one direction and the other, and the offset angle between those spirals showing up right here in the pattern of the sand. We can even see this basket weave in the surface of the ocean. And here I've added just some scaling angles to show you, highlight. In fact, you can see underlying these dynamics in the ocean, exactly how we have seen it in the tree and in the sand. And this is why I call this the field pattern, because it's really informing how nature is coordinating the dynamics of flow, even in a tree trunk, because it's still based on flow, as everything is. I'm sure you all already know this, but it becomes very apparent here. And here is one last example of I find very compelling. It's not the last example, but in this section here of spherical refraction. My friend Clay Taylor studied the refraction of sunlight through a crystal sphere, the most fundamental form, and made this illustration of the spectral lines and the angles of that refraction, and it's exactly the same phi scaling angle. So even the most fundamental geometric form and the most fundamental relationship of light being refracted through matter is showing the exact same scaling angle. I wanted to just share with you some other examples of this angle in nature. We can find it in the starfish, in the seashell cone shells, in this fan shell here. We can see it in the overall form of the spruce tree, and even in the fractal branching of the spruce tree. So you can see that fractal nature of this pattern and of this angle. Here we see it in our own bodies, in the shape of the torso, the angle of the rib cage. You can see here the angle coming down along the ribs, and even the pelvis and the femurs coordinating in that angle, and many instances of the phi ratio within our own bodies. So we are just as much an expression of this natural phenomenon as everything else is in nature. Now this part of it is really key to understanding how this is all happening and why. And it has to do with what's called phi damping. This comes from the work of one of my teachers named Richard Merrick, who has a wonderful book called Interference Theory, and he calls it Harmonic Interference Theory. And he describes really what the phi ratio is doing in terms of how it creates resonance in sound and in music, and the role it plays, which is fundamentally to create the boundary, the silent space around which it creates a container around which then resonance can occur, within which, I should say, within which resonance can occur in this silent space container. And so phi is defining the natural boundary conditions between the foreground resonating frequencies and the background silent space between them. And when I came to understand this, it was the first time I looked at these forms like the pine cone and the sunflower, and I realized that the seeds, as we see them in the pine cone and here in the sunflower, these are the resonance points. This is matter coming into resonance, just like a musical tone comes into resonance. And in order for that resonance to occur, it needs to be contained in a specific harmonic space of silence surrounding it. And so this space between all these seeds is what the phi ratio is doing in order for that resonance to even occur in the first place. And I found it to be extremely profound insight and very helpful to understand how these dynamics are working. And he describes these as what he calls phi damping wells, which are basically, there's a threshold above which, and the ratio is 13:8, which is really based on the musical octave. And the music system is very much based on the phi Fibonacci number system. So above this ratio, the frequencies come into whole number resonance that we experience as music and overtones. And below this, the frequencies that are no longer harmonious, that are no longer in the ratio of whole numbers with the source frequency, they get basically taken down into these little vortices that bring it back to the 0-point field. Basically cancel it back out using these Fibonacci numbers. I think it's a very profound insight and can inform a lot of our harmonic science study yet to come. Now, this vortex would be the same phi scaling angle because it's based on the same ratio of numbers, just as we derive that angle from. So this shows really the fundamental nature of the phi ratio, its role in the universe to provide both damping and resonance, and how the mechanics of that can be understood to be working. Finally, I just wanted to highlight its relationship to the Russian pyramids, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. I'm sure more so than even I am in your vast years of study of the pyramids. Of course, the Russian pyramids are very steep in their angle, very tall and narrow in their geometry. And in fact, that is based on the exact same angle, this phi scaling angle. So this particular form of pyramid is directly correlated to what we see occurring throughout nature, as I've just shown you, in all sorts of ways. And my friend Charlie Zietz, I think many of you know Charlie, has been studying the Russian pyramids quite a lot, and he created this illustration of summarizing the pyramid geometries: the Giza pyramid, the Golden Ratio pyramid, the Nubian pyramid and the Russian pyramid. And of course, the Russian pyramid fits precisely within that phi scaling angle geometry. And this is Charlie's logo. And I think it's a wonderful illustration of showing how these dynamics of energy flow through these torus vortex spirals, all growing within these phi ratio proportions, are really happening or occurring when you create this kind of a geometry. It's really coming into a harmonic resonance with that fundamental field pattern and that phi scaling angle that we see throughout nature. So this gives us a lot of insight into what may be actually occurring within those pyramids. And so that's my introduction and overview to the phi scaling angle, the nature's basket weave of coherence. And I hope that's helped to bring some insight into your fields of research and at least give some insight into how nature is coordinating in this beautiful, coherent manner. And I just want to close by saying namaste and thank you very much. And it's been a great pleasure to be here with you today. And I hope that this has brought some new insight into your explorations.